The morning sun bathed the bustling park in a golden glow, its rays filtering through the canopy of trees. Children laughed as they chased each other across the grass, while joggers weaved through the winding paths. At the center of it all sat Malik Johnson, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor, sipping coffee on a bench. His presence was unassuming, yet his sharp eyes and confident posture hinted at a quiet strength. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and dark jeans, he looked every bit the professional he was, a successful architect who had just wrapped up a meeting nearby. Malik scrolled through his phone, catching up on emails, when a sharp voice cut through the peaceful ambience. "Excuse me." He looked up to see a woman in her late 50s, her face twisted in a scowl. Her arms were crossed, and her tone was dripping with disdain. Malik raised an eyebrow, unsure if she was addressing him. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. The woman stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "Do you even belong here? Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The nearby chatter died down as heads turned, their owners unsure how to react. A jogger slowed to a stop. A couple on a nearby bench exchanged uneasy glances. Even the children seemed to sense the tension, their laughter fading into an awkward silence. Malik's jaw tightened, but he remained seated, his expression unreadable. He had heard variations of this before, subtle microaggressions veiled insults and outright bigotry. But this was different. This was public, brazen, and meant to humiliate. The woman, emboldened by the attention, raised her voice. "Well, aren't you going to say something?" The crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Malik's response. Would he retaliate with anger? Would he walk away? The tension was palpable, a spark waiting to ignite. Malik set his coffee cup down slowly, his movements deliberate. He stood, towering over the woman, and for a moment she flinched. But instead of shouting or lashing out, he took a deep breath, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her take a step back. "Ma'am," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I think it's time we had a conversation." The crowd leaned in, captivated. Whatever they had expected, this wasn't it. Malik's composure was disarming, and the woman, now visibly uneasy, hesitated. The stage was set for a confrontation that would leave no one untouched. The park seemed to hold its breath as Malik stood tall, his gaze steady and unyielding. The woman, whose name tag pinned to her blouse read Linda, shifted uncomfortably under his stare. Her initial bravado wavered, but she crossed her arms tighter, as if the gesture could shield her from the weight of the moment. Malik's mind raced, though his outward demeanor remained calm. He thought of his grandmother, who had fled the Jim Crow South, her stories of resilience echoing in his ears. He thought of his father, who had worked double shifts to send him to college, and his mother, who had taught him to wear his blackness with pride. This wasn't just about him. It was about every ancestor who had fought for his right to stand in this park, in this country, as an equal. "You think I don't belong here," Malik began, his voice carrying a quiet authority that commanded attention. "But let me ask you something. Do you know where your ancestors came from? Do you know what they endured to give you the life you have today?" Linda opened her mouth to retort, but no words came out. The crowd, now fully engrossed, edged closer, their murmurs fading into silence. Malik continued, his tone measured but piercing. "Africa isn't just a place you tell people to go back to. It's the cradle of civilization. It's where humanity began. My ancestors were brought here in chains, and yet they built this country alongside yours. So, when you tell me to go back, you're not just insulting me, you're erasing history. Your history." A man in the crowd nodded, his arms crossed as he listened intently. A young woman clutching a toddler's hand looked down, her cheeks flushed with shame. Even Linda's defiant stance seemed to falter, her eyes flickering with something akin to doubt. Malik took a step closer, not to intimidate but to connect. "You don't know me. You don't know my story. But I'll tell you this. I'm as much a part of this country as you are, and I have every right to be here, just like you do." The air was thick with tension, but also with something else, anticipation. The crowd waited, their eyes darting between Malik and Linda, wondering how she would respond. Would she double down on her hate, or would Malik's words crack the shell of her prejudice? For the first time, Linda looked unsure. Her lips parted, but before she could speak, Malik raised a hand, not to silence her, but to offer an olive branch. "This doesn't have to be a fight," he said softly. "It can be a conversation. But only if you're willing to listen." The crowd leaned in, their collective breath held. The stage was set for a moment that could either deepen the divide or bridge it. And Malik, standing tall and unshaken, was ready to lead the way. The park was eerily silent, save for the distant chirping of birds and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. All eyes were fixed on Malik and Linda, the tension between them palpable. Malik's words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation all at once. Linda's face flushed, her earlier defiance now tinged with uncertainty. She glanced around as if searching for support, but the crowd offered none. Malik took a deep breath, his voice steady but infused with emotion. "You see, Linda, when you say things like, 'Go back to Africa,' you're not just attacking me. You're attacking every person of color who has ever been told they don't belong. You're attacking the idea that this country is a melting pot, a place where anyone can build a life, no matter where they come from." Linda's arms uncrossed, her hands falling to her sides. She opened her mouth to speak, but Malik gently raised a hand, not to silence her, but to ask for a moment. "Let me tell you something," he continued, his tone softer now. "I was born in Chicago. My parents were born in Alabama. Their parents were born in the same state, but they weren't allowed to vote to go to school with white children or even to drink from the same water fountains. And yet they persevered. They fought for a better future, for me, for my children, and yes, even for people like you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. An elderly man in a baseball cap wiped his eyes, while a young couple exchanged glances, their expressions thoughtful. Linda's gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of Malik's words was too much to bear. Malik stepped closer, his voice now barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of generations. "I don't hate you, Linda. I don't even know you. But I do know this. Hate only breeds more hate, and I refuse to let your words define me or this moment." For the first time, Linda looked up, her eyes meeting Malik's. There was a flicker of something, remorse perhaps, or the beginnings of understanding. She opened her mouth again, but this time no venom came out. Instead, her voice trembled as she whispered, I didn't mean to." The crowd leaned in, their collective breath held. This was the turning point, the moment when anger could either dissolve into understanding or harden into resentment. Malik's response would determine the course of what came next. He smiled faintly, not with triumph, but with compassion. "It's okay to not know," he said, "but it's not okay to stay ignorant. Let's talk." The crowd erupted into soft applause, their relief and admiration palpable. Linda, tears welling in her eyes, nodded silently. The stage was set for a conversation that could change everything. The applause that rippled through the park was hesitant at first, like the first drops of rain before a storm. But as Malik's words sank in, the clapping grew louder, more confident. People who had been strangers moments ago exchanged glances, their shared humanity bridging the gaps between them. Even the children who had paused their games to watch the unfolding drama clapped their small hands, sensing the importance of the moment. Linda stood frozen, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and her hands trembled at her sides. She looked around, as if seeing the crowd for the first time, not as an audience, but as witnesses to her vulnerability. Malik's calm demeanor had disarmed her, and his willingness to engage rather than retaliate had left her speechless. A middle-aged woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm sorry," she said, addressing Malik. "I'm sorry for not saying something sooner. We all should have." Her words seemed to break the dam. One by one, others in the crowd began to speak up. "You're right, man," said a young guy in a hoodie, his hands shoved into his pockets. "We've all got to do better." An elderly woman with a cane nodded vigorously. It's not enough to just stand by. We've got to stand up. Linda, still standing in the center of it all, seemed to shrink under the weight of their words. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, she looked at Malik, her eyes pleading for something, forgiveness perhaps, or guidance. Malik stepped closer to her, his expression softening. This isn't about shaming you, he said gently. It's about learning. We all have biases, but it's what we do with them that matters. Linda nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't realize. None of us do, Malik replied, until someone shows us. The crowd, now fully engaged, began to disperse, but the energy of the moment lingered. A group of teenagers approached Malik, shaking his hand and thanking him for his words. A mother with a stroller smiled at him, her eyes glistening with tears. Even the jogger who had stopped earlier gave him a thumbs up before resuming his run. As for Linda, she stood there for a long moment, her shoulders slumped but her head held high. She turned to Malik, her voice trembling but sincere. Thank you, she said. I have a lot to think about. Malik nodded, offering her a small smile. We all do. The park, once a stage for confrontation, had become a place of connection. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass, it was clear that something profound had shifted, not just for Linda, but for everyone who had been there to witness it. The park slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the air felt different. Lighter, as if a collective burden had been lifted. Malik remained on the bench, his coffee now cold, watching as people went about their day. The encounter had left him emotionally drained, but also hopeful. Change, he knew, often began with a single moment, a single conversation. Linda lingered nearby, her earlier defiance replaced by a quiet introspection. She approached Malik hesitantly, her hands clasped in front of her. Can I sit? She asked, her voice tentative. Malik nodded, gesturing to the space beside him. Of course. She sat down, her movements slow and deliberate, as if unsure of her place. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Linda broke it. I'm sorry, she said, her voice cracking. I didn't realize how hurtful my words were. I've just always been so angry, and I took it out on you. Malik turned to her, his expression kind but firm. Anger doesn't come from nowhere. What's really bothering you? Linda hesitated, then sighed. I lost my job last year. My husband left me. I feel like the world's moving on without me, and I guess I wanted someone to blame. Malik nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. It's easy to lash out when we're hurting, but blaming others won't fix what's broken inside us. Linda wiped a tear from her cheek. How do you stay so calm? After everything people like me have put you through? Malik smiled faintly. Because I've learned that anger only hurts me in the end. And because I believe people can change if they're willing to try. The two sat in silence for a while, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Around them, the park buzzed with life, children laughing, couples strolling, joggers passing by. It was a reminder that the world kept turning no matter what. Finally, Linda stood, her posture straighter, her eyes clearer. Thank you, she said quietly, for not hating me. Malik stood as well, offering her a handshake. I don't hate you, Linda. I hope you find peace. She shook his hand, her grip firm, and then walked away, her step slower but more purposeful. Malik watched her go, a sense of quiet satisfaction warming his chest. As he turned to leave, a young boy ran up to him, his face beaming. Mister, you're my hero, he said, holding out a fist for a bump. Malik chuckled, tapping the boy's fist. Nah, kid, I'm just a guy who believes in second chances. And with that, he walked away, the sun setting behind him, casting a golden glow over the park. The day had been a reminder that even in the face of hate, kindness could prevail, and that sometimes the most powerful response was simply to listen.